Gang, how's it going out there? Here we are with the final part of chapter 36, the long chapter. In fact, I lost this lecture. This is my second time doing it. So, I don't know, it was on YouTube and then it wasn't. So before I could post it to Blackboard, it somehow self-destructed. And by that time, I had already deleted it from my camera, so it was taking up space. Anyway, I did check the YouTube prior to this and essentially left off with the tide turning of World War II. Right? So if you're wondering where we are, go back and look at the first two videos. Make sure you watch the PBS People's History Total War video that helps to explain the prosecution of World War II and the human suffering at the individual level of people's history. So that link will be in Blackboard announcements as well. Here we are actually closing in on the conclusion of the semester. I don't know if it'll be the conclusion of our quarantine or not. There are some hopeful signs actually from where I stand today. Remdesivir, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, does seem to have some efficacy in treating people with COVID-19. So we need treatments, we need testing, we all need to be tested, right? Some of us have probably already had the virus and not shown at least major symptoms. We might have some antibodies now against reinfection. This is all theoretical, and I'm not a doctor. I don't even play one on television, but I will not advise that you drink bleach or try to inject it or somehow get ultraviolet rays in your body either. So I am at least following the evidence-based interpretations of the science. So a little bit hopeful signs, but we do need a treatment for the sick. We need testing for the rest of us. We need contact tracing in case someone is ill. Who is that person been in contact with over the previous 2 weeks? So there's a lot there, and for folks thinking about majors, right? History, yes, we kind of talked about this coronavirus thing. Believe me, history is not a predictive science, but we talked about how pandemics, epidemics have shaped human history. Kind of saw this coming, but certainly not at this level. I probably would have been like some of your senators and invested or sold my shares of stock or something, invested more wisely. I didn't think it'd come to this level. Anyway, so history, good one, but also STEM stuff, right? Mathematics is giving us projections of how this thing will go. The scientists, the researchers, the medical professionals, some really interesting and useful careers. Okay, so here we go. Our predecessors of the early 1940s did not always have the choices that you and I have, right? So, in fact, my first boss when I was 16 years old, Spiro Bello, grew up in Jamestown, New York, 19 years old, 1942, shipped off to fight in the Pacific Theater of War and saw some really awful things. So he came back to Jamestown and wanted to put the war behind him and actually began to work with kids, with the YMCA. So he wanted to wage peace for the rest of his life, which he did. So, Pacific Theater of War. Yeah, that tide of battle turns actually by mid-1942 with American victories at the Battle of Midway Island, kind of halfway across the ocean, and Coral Sea in the south. And thereafter, not to make certainly a really, really difficult conflict short by any means, but island hopping toward the home island of Japan. And I think previously we talked about how Japanese technology was great in 1938, but by 1945 it fell behind that of the United States. This great arsenal of democracy, right? The United States had faster planes and more agile planes, right? And in fact, by 1945, the Japanese did not have a lot of pilots remaining. They did not have the air defenses they needed. So as American bombers came within range of Japan itself, there was little defense. And if you've watched that video that I posted, it's 50 minutes long if you've not, so save some time. But you'll see that there are Japanese children working in factories, right? There are Japanese pilots who are poorly trained. They're trained to crash into American naval vessels in the name of Shinto, of their religion, right? The emperor was believed to have been a god. People trying to fight, practice how to fight urban fires with buckets. It's just not going to work, right? Especially once the United States had, along with the British allies and refugees from fascist nations developed atomic weaponry without telling the Soviets, by the way, although Stalin's spies informed him, utilized atomic weaponry on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, just a few days later, obliterating the lives of tens of thousands immediately and perhaps hundreds of thousands more over the ensuing decades due to radiation sickness and cancers. Japan will surrender officially September 2nd, 1945. The treaty is signed really unconditionally, although the United States does allow Hirohito to remain on the throne as the emperor. He must tell the people that he's not divine from the gods. Okay? Keep in mind from our previous lecture, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy had already surrendered. Right? 2 weeks after the death of Adolf Hitler, what was left of the Nazi high command in May of 1945 surrendered. So the war is over. A VE Day, victory over Europe, VJ Day, victory over Japan. One thing I want to mention before we close this map, the Korean Peninsula. Japan had held Korea since really the late 1890s. When the Japanese were defeated, their troops, their administration had to return to Japan, accepting the surrender of Japanese troops above, if you can see my pen, look it up on Google, or Google Images, the 37th parallel. The Soviets took the Japanese surrender below that line. The United States took that surrender. Ultimately, we're going to have two Koreas, right? A north friendly to the Soviet Union that goes communist, a south friendly to the United States. Okay? And within about 5 years following the end of World War II, there'll be another conflict, not as global, but it will pull in the United States, the Korean War, 3-year struggle over control of the Korean Peninsula that, with all due respect to the 40-some thousand Americans who died, the millions of Koreans who died, no territory changed hands. Almost no territory changed hands. The United States pushed northward toward the border with China, whereupon millions of Chinese soldiers, volunteers they were called, came across the Yalu River. The United States war is actually we say the Cold War did not turn hot, but American pilots were fighting Soviet pilots in the skies above the peninsula. Something not well known until more recently. That is an episode of the Cold War, which will be our next topic. So Japan has surrendered. The Axis powers, yes, had surrendered prior. The defeat of the Axis powers was really spelled by the entry of the Soviet Union, the resistance offered by especially the Chinese, the French as well, the United States official entry, December 1941. So the Soviets had this great human capacity, the Americans had this great industrial capacity. After the Soviet offensive in 1943 from Stalingrad, okay, pushing the Nazis, the whole Sixth Army had to surrender, von Paulus surrendered, a great story there, pushed back toward Germany. Keep in mind, as I mentioned previously, the Soviets are pushing the Nazi troops back toward Germany, and the American troops, the British troops, are in North Africa. Right? They don't open a second front until 1943, and that's here, which is a really hard slog to Italy. Even though Italy surrendered, Mussolini will be jailed, rescued, killed by his own people, hanged, the correct word is hanged, by a lamppost. Want some grisly images? Look that up too. Okay? So the Italian surrender, in fact, in many Italian towns, the Americans were greeted as liberators from fascism. But it's a hard slog. The other major front doesn't open until June of 1944 here in northern France, when American, British, Canadian, French troops that had taken refuge in Great Britain, the map makers here misspelled, Australians push into France, liberate Paris in August 1944, and then push into Germany. An amazing scene in the spring of 1945 where American troops coming to the banks of the Elbe River, the bridge was all kind of wrecked and torn up, and they look on the other side, and there are troops on the other side, and they say, hold your fire, because the troops on the other side were Soviets, right? They were the Russians, so to speak, the Red Army. And what do you think? If we were in class, I always ask this question, like, what do you think happened? The Americans are on one side of the river, the Soviets are on the other, and students are like, they shot each other. No, of course not. They got to the middle of the bridge and they hugged one another, okay? This was the end of the war, almost, for them, right? They could see the vice was closing. They smoked together, they danced together, they hugged one another. Keep in mind, the Soviets drafted women into their combat troops, okay? So the war was seen to be ending, at least in Europe, by, well, April of 1945, so it would be done within a month. Okay. So the vice closes on Germany, and what happens? Okay, I mentioned all this other stuff, right? Midway, Germany will be divided. In fact, Europe itself will be divided. If I can oversimplify, which is what we do in survey courses, where the Soviets marched, the Soviets stayed and propped up, set up Moscow-friendly governments. So if your nation, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, the Baltic states, Eastern Germany was either liberated or conquered by, depending on your perspective, the Red Army, you're going to be communist for about the next 45 years, okay? There will not be free elections, even though Stalin promised that to Roosevelt, okay? At Yalta, the last time the big three got together, that will not happen. And that will set the stage for the Cold War, which is also crammed into this chapter. Deserves a chapter unto itself. Life during wartime, occupation was awful for the people who faced occupation, exploitation, enslavement. The Nazis were especially vicious in enslaving people for work, for labor, in armaments factories and chemical factories. Just awful stuff. Japanese enslaving Korean girls, Chinese girls for sexual purposes of their troops, these so-called comfort women. So what do? Do you collaborate? Do you tell the Nazis where the Jews are hiding? Or do you resist? Because it's really hard to sit on the fence. Okay? And if you choose unwisely, you're going to pay. It's one side or the other is going to make you pay. And in fact, a lot of collaborators were maltreated once the war was over. Those who befriended, who at least supported the Nazis or the Japanese, they might not have lived to see the end of the war. Okay? So, the Holocaust, systematic inhumanity that took the lives of millions of people because of their Jewish heritage, their Jewish religion, also Jehovah's Witnesses, gays, lesbians, communists, liberals, people with mental illnesses, people who spoke out against the Nazis were seen as mentally ill. Okay? They were subject to execution. So this just unbelievable, okay? Which is why there are actually people out there denying that this even happened. Because it's unbelievable. I mean, some people go along with like this didn't happen because it's hard to believe that it actually did happen. But it did. I've been to Auschwitz and Birkenau. It's very horrific sites, okay? Very horrific sites. Look, people would resist when they could. Jewish people from throughout Eastern Europe will be crammed into a section of Warsaw that was walled off. And they decided to fight with homemade weapons, with whatever they could get their hands on. They fought off elite Nazi troops for weeks before they succumbed. They knew they were going to be defeated, but that's how they chose to go out. 1943. Our textbook that we use shows, I'd rather call these death camps, okay? Concentration camps is a more broad term. So death camps, extermination camps. Germany, especially Eastern Germany, but most especially some of the bigger ones in Poland, staffed by the Nazis, right? These are German-run camps. In the Baltic states, people were machine gunned into pits. They were forced to dig pits. They were stripped naked and machine gunned into them. Okay, so this is awful inhumanity, which happens when people lose their ability to think critically. Okay? These were ordinary people. The killers were ordinary people. I was just following orders. Just had to do it. Life during wartime was difficult. Women in war, women took on military roles, as I mentioned in the Soviet Union, but also for the Chinese, especially the Chinese communists. Women were certainly involved in resistance movements in France and in China as well. Women were drafted into industrial work in Britain. They were encouraged to go into factory work in the United States. They helped to bring about the defeat of the Axis powers, which we've already mentioned. 60 million deaths, we don't even know. Somewhere between 50 and 60 million. Mostly civilian, mostly of the Soviet Union. Entire society is devastated. The Cold War then would ensue, would follow, in which we'd see a collapse of the alliance. The Soviets on one side, the United States on the other. They'd met in Yalta, there we go, the big three there. Roosevelt not looking healthy. In fact, he'll be dead within 2 months, after 2 months. Stalin promised Roosevelt that there would be free elections in Eastern Europe. They'd never happen. Well, they didn't happen until after 1990 anyway. Potsdam, the big three met again, but it's a different big three. Churchill's party did not win a majority in Parliament. Clement Attlee, Labour Party, promising nationalized health care, the welfare state, so-called, not by William Beveridge, but who put this together, but the state that gave back for the sacrifices of the people is elected. So Churchill's out, Roosevelt's dead, Vice President, now President Truman is sitting there, and so Stalin. Okay? Stalin's troops occupied Eastern Europe, and there they stayed. They set up Soviet-friendly governments. The United States will see that as empire building, whereas Stalin, don't want to get into his head too deeply, Soviet planners saw that as creating buffer states. We have faced 2 invasions in the same century from the West. That will never happen again. So we're going to have governments in Poland and Romania and Hungary. Yugoslavia becomes somewhat different, communist but not allied with the Soviet Union. There will be buffer states to our west to protect us from invasion from that direction. Churchill, out of office, will say an iron curtain has descended upon Europe, dividing it between democracy and communism, or between capitalism and central planning. Truman Doctrine called for intervention to prevent the spread of communism. So the United States will help nations that were not communist, even if they're not liberal democratic nations. Okay? Along with that, we see the Marshall Plan. The United States will pump money into nations to prevent them from voting for communism. Communism, how do you stop the Soviets from invading from Eastern Europe to westward? Well, you put troops in Western Europe. But how do you stop the French or the Italians or the Greeks or the Turks from voting to be communists? They're hungry, they're out of work, they're out of hope. Pump money into those economies. Give them jobs. When people buy things, they tend to not want to be communist. So the Marshall Plan, not very popular among many Americans, right? Why are we sending money over there? You never see it again. No, but it's cheaper to send money than to send your young men in the coming years. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so a pact of North Atlantic nations that claimed that an attack on one would be equated with an attack on all. They're going to defend each other. Nations of West Europe, including Western Germany, West Germany, the United States, Canada, pledged this kind of almost like League of Nations for themselves. Okay? Countering, a number of years later, longer than I had actually thought originally, the Soviet Union and its forced allies in Eastern Europe created a Warsaw Pact. Both sides spend prodigiously on building up their military, so there's not a peace dividend at the end of the war. The United States builds up its military, especially its Air Force, right? Its nuclear capabilities. Soviet Union goes nuclear in 1949. They had stolen how to make the bomb from the United States. China goes communist in 1949. Truman is going to be blamed. And a year later, North Korean forces invade the South. Truman will launch a police action, it's called, that will better term the Korean War. 3-year struggle, as we mentioned, that results in over 1 million lives lost and really no territory changing hands. In a divided Korean peninsula today, right? Look in the news today. I don't know what North Korea is. Kind of a hermit kingdom with a communist dynasty. Makes no sense. Kim Jong-un is now missing. We think he's hiding from the coronavirus, actually. The United Nations, good comes out of the World War II. The United Nations is established that will work toward peace. It fails on nuclear proliferation. The bomb does spread, technology does spread, but it does help to negotiate some settlements so we don't enter